that as its economy goes down, the white population is going to have to ask itself a question. I mean, if the whole setup is, how do I extract wealth from the land that I stole and the labor I'm stealing from the poor black population, then if you're choking off the economy and everybody's going broke, including the white people, maybe there's no point in pursuing this. That was the hope. The United States was really reluctant to get into this, so was Great Britain. But as Western allies began to dive into the anti-apartheid movement, it began to look really bad. Reagan is president. Reagan Nixon was paranoid, right? So Nixon recorded all the telephone conversations. And there is a telephone conversation where at the UN, a group of black presidents from African countries had voted against something the US was pushing through. I don't even know what it was. And Governor Reagan of California calls up President Nixon on the phone, and he says, those monkeys, who do they think they are, right? Like, Reagan is on the record as being pretty anti-black, racist. It's not a conspiracy theory. We've got him recorded saying anti-black stuff. And he really was not interested. He wanted the white population of South Africa to rule South Africa for all eternity. By this point, whites are like 11% of the population. So this is really rough. What happened was the Republican Party went to President Reagan. They went, look, there's no way we cannot jump onto this. We're already constantly being accused of being racist. We can't look like this anymore. And so Reagan was sort of dragged kicking and screaming into the anti-apartheid movement. And by 1985, we're finally starting to divest and get into boycott. By 1987, the violence has reached such a high pitch level that the South African state starts to re-examine its life choices. And the boycott movement and the divestment movement has done a lot of damage to the economy by 1987. And so South Africans are starting to question, and so is the government. The government entered into secret negotiations with the ANC, and they began heading towards surrender. They realized they didn't have much left. Something had to give. Basically, Botha is replaced by a guy named F.W. de Klerk. He's the last apartheid ruler of South Africa. F.W. de Klerk in 1990, reading the writing on the wall, kind of like Gorbachev in the Soviet Union was reading the writing on the wall, decides he's going to take a huge step as part of, like as a gesture of goodwill to the ANC, and he releases Mandela and a bunch of other imprisoned ANC activists. The next year, they announced that apartheid will be dissolved. In 1994, for the first time in South Africa's history, they have a free and fair election, and Nelson Mandela is elected to be the first black president of South Africa. And so that's how it goes down. It goes down kind of dramatically. One of the reasons why I wanted to tell this story is I just wanted to kind of remind you, yeah, it would be great to be a population of 300 million people facing off against an empire of 50 million people, and you don't do violent protests. You do nonviolent protests and let them beat you until their arms are tired. But when you're in a situation like South Africa was, what were their options? They were literally separated out, sometimes walled off. If you look, still today, there are white neighborhoods that are walled off. There are sections of white cities that are walled off. South Africa is still segregated. It's like Texas, it's like the South. We're still segregated. And we segregated everything. Our radio stations are segregated, our churches are segregated, our neighborhoods are segregated. But it's not the law, but there's all this economic momentum that's not going to go away unless you did what the communists wanted and, collectivize the wealth or something. So when you're isolated like that, other than violence, how do you get the world's attention? In other words, during the periods of time when in South Africa there was no violence, the world didn't care. The world didn't pay any attention. The world paid attention when the police are shooting to death children. The world paid attention when There's the Sharpsville massacre. At these moments where there is these intersections of violence, that's when the world went, oh, maybe there is something wrong in South Africa. Maybe the apartheid state is being unjust. Maybe we shouldn't be trading with them and supporting them. And so one of the narratives that drives me absolutely bonkers is the whole boycott and divestment narrative, that somehow Western Europe and the United States ended apartheid by cutting them off. Cutting them off hurt them, and it definitely incentivized them to go negotiate peace. But the reality is it was the ANC and the anti-apartheid movement that had defeated them. They ended up surrendering basically in 1990. Maybe if we didn't do divestment, they would have surrendered in 1995 or 2000. So we accelerated the process, but we didn't make it happen. In fact, if it wasn't for the resistance, it would have never drawn our attention to the fact that we needed to boycott and divest, right? It was precisely because of that. I mean, the fact that Nelson Mandela was rotting in prison for 27 years, after a while we started to think, geez, what is this? And then that's part of his valorization, right? Like he was this martyr who suffered first in Robben Island, which was this notorious political prison. It's an island off Cape Town, actually. It's north of Cape Town. And there were all these guys trapped on this island. I think he spent 18 years in Robben Island before they moved him to another prison. And they kept moving to a nicer prison until they finally let him go. I think he was in 3 different prisons. And so one of the things that we need to kind of be conscious of is this need for us to make the people that we, like in the case of Nelson Mandela, that we look up to, because he was an amazing leader. He pulled South Africa through this in part, because even in prison, he was still active. He was still writing. He was still communicating with the ANC. He was still helping make decisions. Don't sugarcoat him. Don't whitewash them. In this case, Gandhi wash them. Tell the real story. I mean, the violence against people like Stephen Biko that the South African government does, the violence that's done against these children, this is not an okay event that's happening. It's not unreasonable for violence to be the response, right? I mean, what are we supposed to do? Just lay down and die? Like my classic example of this is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943. So the Nazis had jammed all these Jews into the Warsaw Ghetto and walled them off. And then in 1942, the Nazis showed up and said, okay, we're going to relocate some of you. And I want to say there was like 450,000 people living in the ghetto. The Nazis talk about 300,000 into getting into trains. They took them to a death camp, I think it was Treblinka, and executed them. When word got back to the ghetto that, wait, this is a trick, you're not being relocated, you're being murdered, they armed up and they decided to fight. And they fought tooth and nail for days against the Nazis, which was, I mean, the Soviet Union was having a hard time, and they were heroic and brilliant. They lose in the end, but they felt like, at least we're going to die in struggle. At least we're going to die fighting. We're not going to be just hauled off and murdered. And I can't help but look at that population and go, those guys were the heroes we want to look up to, right? We want to be like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. For the record, there was a Warsaw Uprising and a Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. People get them confused all the time. I used to get them confused. This isn't like just something weird. The Warsaw Uprising was 44 August. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was 43 in April. There's actually a large distance between the two in terms of timeline. And, right, it was a brutal event. In the end, the fire in the ghetto played a major role in the defeat, because what the Jewish resistors had done is they'd gone into the sewers and the basements, and they were fighting with everything they had: Molotov cocktails, homemade weapons. And the Nazis came in with flamethrowers and demolition charges and just tore the place up. But it took them days to capture the place. I want to say it was 10 days. I think it was April 19 to April 29. But there was still resistance all the way into May. May 8, I think, is when the Nazis got to Mila 18. That was the address for the headquarters for the Jewish resistance in the ghetto. And the Nazis had a remote control bomb, and they drove it up to the building, and I think that's how they took them out. But, you know, right, like, to be in that situation and to die that way, isn't that the dream of a person who struggles for freedom? Anyway, so I just thought it'd be nice to remind you of how South Africa now has 9 provinces. Natal and Orange Free State have roughly the same borders. The Bantustans have been reabsorbed. Everybody has citizenship. It's not perfect. There is definitely problems. One of the problems is the whites still own the majority of the wealth. They still own the land. They still have the means of production, right? So there's still a really horrible, unequal wealth distribution. But they did truth and reconciliation. So here's how they did this, because it was ugly on both sides. The estimate is, by the way, that the insurrection killed about 21,000 people. So that's not nothing. That's a huge number of people. Now, obviously, the majority of the dead were the ANC side because the government was doing this, but there was thousands of deaths on the other side as well. So what had to happen to make this work is they needed to come clean, because one of the things you want to do is find all the bodies. So they did truth and reconciliation. If you knew of a crime, even if you had participated in it, or even if you were the one who did the crime, if you came and confessed and told everybody everything you knew, forgiven, no jail sentence, no prison sentence, no trial. It's over. And so thousands of black and white and Indian and colored South Africans ended up going to Truth and Reconciliation and just spilling the beans. And they talked about the crimes they had committed, the crimes they had witnessed, and they went and found the bodies. And so that helped in the healing process. But the deal was that if you didn't tell within the time frame, you got caught later, and then you could be tried. So it was really in your best interest to come clean, and that happened. So as imperfect as South Africa is, I think it has a path forward in the future that just means more and more peace, right? Especially as the new generations become less and less race conscious and wealth starts to get more equally distributed.